Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. Let me get out of the way some of the easy questions that you asked, first of all. You asked about the boundary waters and what is happening with the Senate vote on HJ 140, which is the change in the rules that is a huge power grab for the Republican Party, and that got through the House and would permit a Chilean mining company to do some sulfide mining above the boundary waters in Minnesota that people sort of across the board are opposed to. This is enormously unpopular, not least because if anything makes it into the boundary waters, it could kill hunting and fishing and kayaking and all the things that people like to do up there, and destroy the small businesses that are supporting that use of the land, that are in the recreation economy, which we don't pay enough attention to, I think, in this country. There is you've probably heard me talk about the American West and how we use land in the American West. It's really important to remember that generally mining, agribusiness, the real estate, the kinds of things that the radical right wants to open up that land to do, tends to concentrate wealth in a very, very small group of people, and leaving the rest of the people who live there to work for those very wealthy people. Whereas the recreation economy is one that tends to support small businesses, a lot of small businesses. And one of my big things is how our economy really influences our democracy, because of course in a situation where very few people have all the wealth and power and everybody else doesn't have those things, you have a really different control of politics than you do in a place where lots of people have solid paychecks. And part of the reason for that, of course, is because all the education and so on that goes by the wayside when money gets concentrated then turns into an opportunity for people to just pour money into an election and essentially buy elections, which is what you saw, for example, in Montana last year with Senator John Tester being replaced by Sheehy, who's the guy who recently appears to have broken the Marine's arm. I'm not going to talk much about that today because there's plenty of other stuff to get to. Anyway, so far the Senate has not taken up HJ 140. And that's because of complaints about it. So keep your voices coming on that. That is still before the Senate. And by the way, you can, if you ever wonder, you can check this stuff the same way I do. There is online a tracker from the Library of Congress, I think it is. Let's see here. Nope, it's from Congress itself, tracking where bills are, what's happened to them, and where bills are, and it's pretty easy to use. So it's at congress.gov, and right now the bill is in front of the Senate, but the Senate has not yet taken it up. All right, so that was an easy question. Another easy question was you asked about, speaking of Montana. Montana is a really interesting state, and I will try not to go too far down this rabbit hole. But Montana is a great example of a state that really comes into the union as one that is controlled by a very few people because of the mining industry there. Montana actually opens up during the Civil War because of the mines in Montana. And that's how we get the Bozeman Trail that cuts off of the Overland Trail. And you know what? Someday I'll do a whole lecture on Montana history. But what happens in Montana is it very quickly becomes a really corrupt state where a very few people basically run everything. This is in the late 19th century. And what we get out of that, weirdly enough, is this history of being able to see in a kind of a microcosm of what happens when a handful of men, in that case, take over all the wealth and power in a state. But then in the early 20th century, it becomes so corrupt that the people of Montana rewrite the Constitution and pass a whole bunch of laws that try and guard against a very few people taking over the political and the economic system. And interestingly enough, that's, of course, where we get the direct election of senators, so that they can't really be bought. The legislature can't really be bought to hand over a position to some, tool of the mining industry. But it's also where we have had since then the ability to push back against concentrated money. Often cases come out of Montana. And actually, by the way, that's happening right now. One of the big challenges to Citizens United is coming out of Montana. But anyway, so you have in Montana this weird mix of extraordinary corruption and yet this extraordinary attempt of the people in Montana to push back. And what people asked about what was happening, that there was something funny that happened yesterday. I think it was yesterday, and that was some shenanigans going on with the Republican primary. And what happened there, and the Republicans, this is really pretty rare for it to happen, but Democrats have done it too. What happened there is Steve Daines, who was a Republican senator from Montana, kept open the possibility that he was going to run for reelection. And incumbents in our system have such a leg up over everybody else that many people will not get into a race if there's an incumbent, a fairly popular incumbent, because it's not worth anybody's time or money. So they watch really like a hawk. And if you ever care, this is why people watch so quickly the deadline for filing for reelection or for filing to be elected. So nobody jumped in the pond on the Republican side to challenge Daines because they figured, what's the point? And the same was true on the Democratic side. There would have been probably some quite hard hitters, big names jumping into the Senate race if they had known Daines was going to drop out. So he didn't tell anyone he was going to drop out. And I won't have the times right, I don't think. But let's say the deadline was 5:00 for probably, I don't know what the date was, but it was 5:00. He had to, either file his papers or not by 5:00. And what he did was about 7 minutes before the end of the deadline, his hand-picked replacement, hasn't primaried, hasn't done anything, hasn't even said he was going to do anything. He filed the paperwork, and then 3 minutes later, Daines dropped out. It was too late for anybody else to get into the race. So that's what happened there. The presumption is that will give this guy a huge leg up, because essentially he doesn't have the Democrats who would have run against him, really hard-hitting, big name Democrats in Montana that are, didn't jump in the race, and they probably would have. Certainly off the top of my head, I can think of a couple of them who probably would have thrown their hats in the ring. They didn't, because they thought Daines was going to be in there. And then the Republican challengers to this guy also didn't throw their hats in the race. So all of a sudden, that kind of looks like them saying, we don't care what the primary voters think. We're just going to pick our own people, which is kind of becoming a hallmark of the Republican Party in this moment. So that's what happened in Montana. That was an easy thing to get around. And then you asked me for a description of who Mark Wayne Mullen is, because you hadn't heard of him. And I will tell you, I have frequently joked that he and Tommy Tuberville were in a hotly contested race to be the dumbest people in the Senate, and they certainly come across that way. Mark Wayne Mullen, whom Trump has tapped to replace Kristi Noem, and let's be very clear here, it's astonishing to me that the legacy media tends not to be reporting this, but Trump just can't slot anybody else into that seat. Mullen will have to be confirmed by the Senate. And that's probably why Trump chose him for a number of reasons. But first of all, because there is in the Senate kind of a clubbiness that means the Senate tends to confirm its own. So Marco Rubio, of course, sailed through as Secretary of State in a bit of a surprise. It wasn't a surprise at all that he got confirmed, but that he behaved so differently once he was confirmed than everybody, including me, by the way, thought he would act. I thought he was, for Trump, a fairly safe pick. And then, of course, he suddenly became a crazy Trumper. So by picking Mullen, I think what Trump is suggesting is that he recognizes, or at least Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, recognizes that Trump is unpopular enough right now that it's going to be hard to get somebody through the Senate. And by picking a senator, that would make it easier, just because there's that senatorial courtesy that tends to do that. That's not to say he's going to walk on through, but when I saw Mullen, the first thing I said was, oh, he's worried about getting anybody else through. Now, that being said, Mullen himself is a member of the Cherokee Nation. I believe he is the second member of the Cherokee Nation to serve in Washington, in the Senate, I think, but that's just off the top of my head, so please don't quote me on that. And he does not have a bachelor's degree. I believe he's the only member of the Senate who does not have a bachelor's degree. He has an associate's degree in a construction-related industry, and really no experience at all in what he is being asked to do here as the Director of Homeland Security. And I think that's really key, because it's important to remember that when Kristi Noem, who was the former now Secretary of Homeland Security, got in trouble before, she told the newspapers through a surrogate that everything she had done under orders from President Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. And they pushed back on that, and then she said, no, I didn't really mean that, when she started getting back in people's good graces. But I think it's pretty clear that it's Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of staff, who's really pushing the extraordinary violence of the federal agents who are acting under the Department of Homeland Security, and of course, President Donald Trump. So there is a thing that presidents do when they're in political trouble. They tend to find a sacrificial lamb and toss it overboard. And that certainly, there is no doubt that is what they are trying to do with Noem, but it's important to remember that she was, kind of a shield for Trump and Miller, and losing her is, we'll probably be spared the videos from now on. I doubt Mullen will have that kind of video presence, which Noem did in part with the help of her advisor, Corey Lewandowski. And I don't think Mullen will do that. That doesn't seem to be his style, but I think it's pretty easy to assume that he will not be his own man in that position. He will simply do whatever Trump and Miller tell him to do. And which, I could be wrong about that. I will say I am, even for somebody who is a fervent MAGA, he's from Oklahoma, by the way, is a fervent MAGA, that is not a job I would want right now. Under what circumstances would you want to go into a department that has gone so rogue that Congress is refusing to fund it? And, one that is in this much trouble, maybe that reflects his perhaps unawareness of just how difficult a job that's going to be. But so anyway, that's who he is. Now, let me get then into things I'm sorry, there's another. These all kind of tie together, but once I've knocked off these questions, I will try and tie everything together the way I do. You asked about the issue of transgender, the licenses of transgender people in Kansas. And I'm glad, it's really interesting, because when that story first broke, it broke on Aaron in the Morning, who's very, very good about transgender issues as well as other issues as well. And it seemed a little bit of a sleeper issue. And I'm happy to say, as of, I think it's today, it's been broadcast all over the country. And I wrote about it a while back, but what is at stake there in the little sense is that the legislature of Kansas passed a law that made the licenses of transgender Kansans invalid immediately, as in the next day. Which, again, you think licenses, right? I don't know about you, but licenses always seem like, do you have the right license? Is it a special? Is it, whatever? But there's actually a big agenda behind the changing of licenses. And that agenda, first of all, you can see by the fact that they made them illegitimate the day after they passed this law. So if you were going to try and fix that problem, you're already walking uphill, because they've just made it, you will be driving on a suspended license if you drive to the DMV. So clearly this is not an attempt to fix a real problem. This is an attempt to create a problem. Or create a population that is considered a problem. And now you say you like my rabbit holes, so I'm going to go down a little rabbit hole now. One of the things we really watch in people who do political history is laws that on their face seem innocuous, but are actually really devastating. And so, one of the ones that I always use as an example of this is in the Reconstruction South in a number of states. It was illegal to sell goods in a marketplace after dark, after dusk, or before dawn. So and the argument was, well, we don't want people on the streets, not on the streets. We don't want people on the roads then because nothing that happens after dark is good, right? There's going to be people on the roads that are going to mug people, and we want to make sure that buying stuff only happens during the daylight. Okay, that sounds fine, right? Except the contracts to which Black Americans were held said that you had to be working in the fields in all the daylight hours. You did not have any free daylight hours. So what that meant was that if a Black person in a state that had a law like that sold anything in the marketplace after dark, simply doing what white people did during the daylight, they were doing something illegal. And that use of seemingly innocuous laws to criminalize certain populations is really big. And it's worth always, when somebody says, well, it makes perfect sense to do X, always, always, always look at the other side of it. So, for example, here's another one of my favorites. In many places, the selling of drugs near a school has way bigger punishments than not selling drugs near a school. And I forget what the distance of that is. And again, you think, well, that's great. You don't want people to sell drugs near a school, right? Except what it means is that if you're living in urban areas and selling drugs because there's so many more schools and people are crowded together, even if you commit the same crime as somebody in a rural area, you are more likely to get a heavier penalty because of what you've done. And there's all kinds of stuff like that embedded in places. Okay, now back to Kansas. When Trump was talking about going after transgender youth, especially, his thing was, we're not trying to cause big problems here. We only want to make sure that transgender people don't play in sports, right? Especially women's sports. And that's it, that's all we're complaining about. Well, of course, this puts the lie to that by making it, the law says in Kansas that your driver's license has to match your sex at birth, and otherwise it's invalid. And you think about what this this can of worms this is going to open up. The ways in which it will make life extraordinarily difficult for transgender people, who, almost all, I actually don't know the numbers, I shouldn't say that, who pass is it with a gender identification different than their sex at birth. This just basically is creating an outcast population. And fortunately, people are calling attention to it and calling it out, but it's one of those moves toward a state that criminalizes a certain population that historians look at with their hair on fire, because this is a constructed emergency by a group of people who are looking to instate in our state, in our national government, ways to distinguish amongst us, amongst citizens, to start to criminalize certain populations of citizens. And so it may be a story that your eyes would sort of skip over because you don't live in Kansas or you're not worried about your license, but it's actually a really big deal. This is how you start. How one starts to criminalize populations is they start with a very, very small population and demonize them and move your way through. So that's the answer to that license issue. Oh, and Kansas actually has very strict driver's license punishments. So if you drive on a suspended license, the fines are pretty bad, and so on. And this law, as it is written, if you somebody who's in I think it's a bathroom and a locker room, with somebody who turns out to be transgender can then sue the person for $1,000 or something. I don't remember the exact details of it. I did read it the other night, but it's really just oh, I'm sorry. And the third piece of that is that it was passed extremely quickly. They basically forced it through the legislature without sending it off to committee for any kind of a conversation. So it's a real power grab, but it's a power grab that is a very dangerous and frightening power grab. All right, so now the bigger questions that are on the table tonight. Although that being said, I just got through all your questions and I've already been here a half hour, so I'll try and be quick, I guess. Um, so Let's start with one other small question you asked, and I will make it bigger. You asked what the Shield of the Americas was, to which Kristi Noem has been reassigned from her position at the head of Homeland Security. And, a lot of people were joking how that is an invented position, and it absolutely is. But I'll tell you why it was on Donald Trump's mind and why it's not okay to kind of look away from what's going on there. It seems very clear that Trump really is trying to reorganize the globe, reorganize the way the world works, not just the United States, but the world works. And this is not news to anybody, right? He says this all the time. And certainly J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller and Secretary of State Marco Rubio and so on have been saying this since January 21st. What they want to do is they want to get rid of the rules-based international order that I've talked about so often, that was constructed after World War II based on three pillars. And the pillars were, first of all, representative democracy, that the United States and its allies, and as many partners as possible, supported the idea of representative democracy. And that works in different ways in different places. But the idea was that in order to have a stable world, you needed to make sure people had a say in their governments. And by the way, that idea of a stable world is a really important one, because we have lived in the United States in safety for so long that I think people forget that that's what a government's supposed to do. It's supposed to keep us safe. That's rule number one. Like, there's other stuff going on too, and there's ways you can expand that. But the idea is that you do not want to put your people in harm's way if you can possibly avoid it. So the idea, and it's not just the United States that feels that way. That's the whole idea of governments, that they're going to protect their people. But the idea after two world wars in a space of a very few years was that we had to find a way to come up with a system that did not have world wars. So they came up with this three-pillared system, and that they were based on the idea of representative democracy and on the idea that world trade was a good thing, because it would tie countries together, and it would have people have monetary ties, but also, you'd become accustomed to other people's food, and you would maybe go to school in other places, and it would sort of tie the world together in a way that would make it harder for individuals to go to war than if everybody was living in their own little bubbles. And it was the third pillar was the idea of international institutions that would, again, weave people together and make it harder, for our NATO troops work in each other's countries. They know each other. And the idea was that you would create safety around the world by creating this kind of web around the world that meant that we had allies in places on the other side of the world, and we would, that you'd make the world a much smaller place based on this, but it would enable that web to tamp down wars, so they would not become world wars. They would stay local. Well, they didn't want even those, but that we'd have these local conflagrations, but we wouldn't have world wars again. And it has worked bloody well for the last 80 years. It has worked. It has enabled the world to remain fairly stable. Again, not world wars. That's not to say we haven't had huge issues, but they have tended to stay localized. Vladimir Putin, who is the president of Russia, wants to tear all that up. because that idea of this web is stopping his imperial ambitions. He wants Ukraine, and he would like to spread his influence further into Europe as well. And of course, all these international institutions are standing against him. And once he invaded Russia for the second time in 2022, um, the international economic system was also standing against him with sanctions, for example, and by excluding him from the banking system that all the other countries use for trans-border exchanges of money, which has badly hurt Russia's economy. So he wants to get rid of that system, and he wants a system of a few sort of great powers with spheres of influence. So you have, the power of Russia, for example, with other countries forced to be satellites to Russia. And mind you, this is a huge power grab for him because Russia is an economically very small and very weak state, but he has managed to leverage a number of things, including his intelligence agencies, to give himself more power than his size or economy should have enabled him to have. But that idea of, a few big dogs and then everybody else having to suck up to those dogs is basically a return to the world before the 20th century. It's not even just before World War II, it's before the 20th century. And the United States under Donald Trump has accepted that idea, that the United States does not want to have this world of these webs of international trade, and it doesn't want to have international institutions like the WHO, the World Health Organization, or the United Nations. I mean, Trump is very clearly trying to replace the United Nations with his Board of Peace and so on. But he wants to replace that with the United States of America in charge of the Western Hemisphere. So when they talked about Nome becoming part of the Shield of the Americas, this is one of the institutions that Trump is trying to put in place between the North American continent and the South American continent that would put the United States essentially in charge of both and let Europe go hang. And this, of course, is exactly what J.D. Vance talked about at the Munich Security Conference last year, and that Marco Rubio talked about at the Munich Security Conference again this year. And, somebody asked, well, J.D. Vance, people are saying that J.D. Vance is against this war in Iran. J.D. Vance is playing this however it comes. I mean, you've noticed he's nowhere to be found. He said he was against the war, but if it was going to happen, he wanted to be fast and decisive. Don't think for a minute that J.D. Vance isn't into this idea of the Western Hemisphere being the background of the United States of America, the playground of the United States of America, because he's unhappy with the democratic traditions of Europe that are permitting immigration. He wants a white America, and he wants a Christian America that reflects his version of Christianity, which is he is a recent convert to a right-wing Catholicism. And if you've noticed, that right-wing Catholicism is actually calling the Pope wrong, which is itself very interesting. And that's actually opened up a fissure in American Catholicism, which had been supporting Trump. The right wing of American Catholicism had really been supporting the right wing politically. And when you start criticizing the Pope and you're a Catholic, a lot of people were not willing to go along with that. And you can see a fissure opening there. But this idea of controlling the Western Hemisphere and leaving Europe to itself is all over what's happening right now. So when Trump has started talking, he's been doing it for a while, but he started talking about Cuba being next. He very much wants for the United States to throw its weight around in Cuba. He influenced in the Honduran election by letting the former Honduran president, who had been convicted in the United States by a jury of drug trafficking, he pardoned him and said, oh, that was a Biden thing, let him out in time for the Honduran election. He threw his way, he tried to get Jair Bolsonaro out of his country, where he was about to be imprisoned for launching a coup. He knocked Nicolas Maduro out of Venezuela, but left the regime intact so long as he was able to control the regime and get money from the oil there. You can see we bailed out Javier Milei in Argentina before his big election. You can see how the United States is taking its power under Trump, or how Trump is taking the power of the United States and essentially turning South America into its playground. And of course, we've been making all these moves against Canada and Greenland. Now, why am I saying that so definitively? Because although it largely fell under the radar screen, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, the name has never been officially changed. Congress would have to do that, was speaking yesterday, I think, at America's Counter Cartel Conference. And there's, by the way, going to be another conference this weekend of the Shield of the Americas in Florida. Which, by the way, if all this takes place, Florida would be the center of this new arrangement, right? Considering where it's located and so on. But in his speech that Hegseth gave to America's Counter Cartel Conference, he basically said that the United States, of course, with the help of everyone down there, is going to use its military power to go after the cartels and bring sort of peace and prosperity to Latin America. And the United States has not spent a lot of time in its press talking about this, but The Guardian had a fabulous piece on it in which they said Latin American countries want absolutely no part of this. The idea of answering the problems of drug cartels with military alone has been tried, and it's been a disaster. That in fact, the old system that we had been using seemed like it was making a difference, and Trump has walked away from that. So when we talk about what's happening around the world, it's really important to keep that idea of this Western Hemisphere reorganization in Trump's mind foremost, because that's happening around us every minute. Now, I'm sure you're listening to me and going, but wait a minute, last I checked, Iran was not in the Western Hemisphere. And that's very true, of course. This is a war of choice, and it bears thinking about who benefits from this war of choice, because of course there's no conversation about it in the United States and in the United States Congress, about which I hope I'll have time to talk for a second. Who does benefit? And Timothy Snyder, a scholar of authoritarianism, has a great piece today saying, the real beneficiaries of this war are exactly those people who allegedly helped push Trump into it. And that's Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, in Saudi Arabia, both of whom have seen Iran as a huge problem in their backyards for a number of years, including, as Snyder points out, 47 years, which is the number that the Trump people keep talking about, the U.S. being at war with Iran, when, of course, in fact, we have not been at war with Iran in that period of time. And it's really interesting to talk that way, because, of course, most of the hijackers on 9/11 were not from Iran, and they were not from Iraq. They were from Saudi Arabia. So this idea that somehow, Iran has been an unusually bad actor that we've been at war with all this time completely rewrites history. So there is this sense that the U.S. is working with oligarchs around the world, and that is in keeping with this idea that America will become under Donald Trump and whomever he leaves this world to, will become part of this oligarchical world that essentially has a sort of monarchy, like a Saudi monarchy in charge of it, or a Putin-style Putin-style authoritarianism in charge of it. And our playground will be the Western Hemisphere. So those are how those things are attached. And there is a really interesting piece of this here that somebody asked about, and I think it's important to highlight, and I will be writing a full letter about it. And that's that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. I'm sorry, I think in words, and I'm seeing the R and thinking, no, I know he's not from Russia, of Rhode Island, gave in the Senate yesterday, in which he really lays out the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room now, since at least 2015, has been the relationship between Donald Trump and Russia and Russian operatives. And he began that speech by talking about how the Mueller report, Robert Mueller, remember the special counsel Robert Mueller, all the way back there, who was supposed to be looking at the ties between the 2016 Trump campaign and Russian operatives, came out with a report that Donald Trump's then Attorney General Bill Barr, anticipated and went out in front of the cameras and said, "Oh, there's nothing here. There was no connection," and so on and so forth. And by the time the report actually came out, everybody had become convinced that that's what the report said. And the report actually said exactly the opposite. The Mueller report is online. So is the follow-up report to that, which is the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation of the Trump campaign's relationship to Russian operatives. And both of them concluded that Russian operatives had, in fact, worked to support the Trump campaign and to denigrate and hurt the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. And the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which was written under a majority of Republicans, and it was unanimous. I believe it's the first time. I could be wrong about that. If not the first, it's one of the very, very, very few times that the Senate Intelligence Committee has unanimously agreed to a report. And that went further than the Mueller report had, saying that because their jurisdictions were different, saying that, in fact, Trump's campaign manager, Paul Manafort, had been giving material from proprietary material from the campaign to his business partner, who was, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee report, a Russian operative. So Sheldon Whitehouse began with that in his speech and said, everybody believed the Mueller report, and that's not what the Mueller report said. And then he went on to talk not just about those two things, but the fact that when somebody asked Trump about the Epstein files recently, he said, "Oh, it's just like the Russia hoax. There's nothing there," which was really interesting because nobody had asked him about that. They'd asked him about Epstein. And the first place his mind went was to Russia. And then Whitehouse outlined the many, many, many connections between Jeffrey Epstein and the Russians, and Donald Trump and the Russians and Jeffrey Epstein, and the degree to which the women that were trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell came from Russia or from former Soviet republics is really pretty astonishing, as is the number of times, for example, that Putin appears in the Epstein files, more than 1,000 times so far. Remember, we're missing a lot of the pages, and at least half of the files. And what Whitehouse said is that, listen, we might never know how deeply involved Epstein was with various intelligence agencies from the US, from Israel, from Russia, and so on. But what we can say is that there's a lot of evidence that Epstein was engaged in blackmail. There are a number of people who claimed to have been shown cameras, that pinpoint cameras, for example, that were all over his home in Manhattan. I mean, one of the things that people keep talking about is the Epstein Island, but of course there was also the New Mexico ranch and the Manhattan townhouse, which people somehow tend to forget that he actually lived in Manhattan. So that too was full of opportunities for capturing people on film. And we know, of course, that there were tons of films taken out of his home during the FBI raid way back in 2019, I'm going to go with, but I don't remember off the top of my head. So Whitehouse sort of says there is an awful lot going on here that suggests that there's a lot of fog here, that suggests that hidden in this fog are connections between the United States under Donald Trump, or under the Trump administration, and the Russians. And as many people say, we don't really need to know what they are to know that what would Trump do? How would he behave differently if he were involved with the Russians? And, one of the things that came out today in the war with Iran is that Treasury, the Secretary Scott Bessent, said the U.S. is considering removing, it's already removed the sanctions on Russian oil for sale to India. It is now considering removing other sanctions on Russian oil. Well, of course, the thing that Putin is most desperate for is more money because of his war against Ukraine and the many ways in which the U.S. under Trump has slowed down giving ammunition to the Ukrainians, has slowed down giving money to the Ukrainians, and has really tended to prop up Russia, is really sort of coming to a head here as Russia is increasingly on the ropes in that war. All of a sudden, what the United States has done by attacking Iran is jacked up the price of oil in a way that the only beneficiaries of that is going to be Russia. I mean, the fact that Russia now has oil that is going to be way, way, way more valuable is going to help Russia it's a huge shot in the arm for Russia. At the same time, in the United States, have you looked at your gas prices lately? And the rise in oil prices is always a huge drag on the economy. So there is, I think, afoot something that's worth watching, and that is that Trump is quite literally trying to change the way the globe has worked for the last 80 years to make it subservient to people like Vladimir Putin, but also to people like Trump. And what we're seeing now is what that looks like. And before I go on to just a little bit on why this is such a problem, I would like to point out that the system that extraordinarily brilliant people put together over the past 80 years, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, in the micro sense, but in the macro sense, the system worked. We know that, and yeah, there are things that I mean, just give me a notebook and I'll tell you the things that I would like to change about it. But the base of it worked. Now, the people who are trying to put in place this new system in the United States of America are people like Donald Trump. And I am sorry, no matter how you slice it, and I will tell you, I think he's a brilliant salesman. He does not have the brain power of the people who put the other system together. So the idea that somehow he's going to be able to rework the United Nations into his Board of Peace and all of a sudden it's going to be great because he's going to be a dictator, which is what the Board of Peace establishes, I got my doubts. But what does this mean for us? You may be glazing over and going, why do I care what the world looks like? Well, first of all, I would say you care because we have become so accustomed to living in a world where the people from the United States of America felt safe. I don't think people understand what it means to live in a world where you don't feel safe, where you or your children or your spouse or whomever can be drafted to go to war into a meat grinder the way they are in Russia right now. Or that you could be like somebody who sends their kids to school and one morning and all of a sudden there's a bomb that comes out of the sky. Those things happen in the world. For the last 80 years, it has been rare for them to happen to Americans. We have mass shootings, of course, but that kind of attack from other countries, we have been relatively safe from, to the point that when it does happen, it becomes, this huge moment. Losing the protections that we've had mean that those threats come back. And you saw that when somebody said to Trump yesterday, should we be worried about attacks on the US soil? And he goes, yeah, I guess it's a war. If in a war, people are going to get killed. Can you imagine any other president going, yeah, I guess probably you're in trouble? That to me was mind-boggling off the charts. You care about it that way, but you also care about it because when the framers put into the Constitution that the only body that could declare war was Congress, they did so for a reason. And, somebody was saying recently, who cares? It's a turf war between the president and Congress, and I like the president. So I'm happy with him doing this. The answer is it's not a turf war, or maybe it is a turf war, but it's a turf war that is really important. The reason that the framers gave the power to declare war to Congress was in part because they did not want to build up the power of a tyrant, the person that they would call a tyrant after having watched what the king had done. And there's actually surprisingly little discussion of that in the Constitutional Convention because it's a non-starter. I mean, it's just a non-starter. There's like 2 pages of conversation about it, and everyone's like, yeah, we're not going to give that power to the king. Not happening. Here to the executive. They don't really have at that point know if it's going to be a king or whatever, but the executive, that's not happening. We're not doing that. But then the question is, well, if the president can't declare war, who can? And they have some debate on that. And what they say is that you must let the representatives of the people debate whether or not to go to war for 2 reasons. For one reason is because it's them that are going to die. They're the ones who are going to end up getting killed if we go to war. And 2, and this one I think is really coming to the fore right now, you need to let people decide whether or not they want to put their treasure, their money, behind a war, because someone's got to pay for that war. And they've been watching Europe for generations get impoverished by kings who send their people out on wars of religion or on wars of ego or whatever. And ultimately, it's the little people who have to put up the cash for it. And what the framers said is that you have to give people the chance to decide how they want to spend their own money. And by forcing it into Congress for a vote, that will give the opposition time to make a case that says, hey, do you really want to spend your money this way? And they will have to convince people of that. They will have to go to the people and say, this is worth your money and your lives. And if they can't, then nobody will go to war. And that's where the impetus to go to war must be. And what we're seeing right now is the arguments I've been reading today, the arguments on the Republicans for not standing against this war. And what they say is, well, he shouldn't have brought us into this war, but now that he's there, we can't back out because that's going to be even worse. And I don't buy that, because that is our lives and money that are on the line. And every day puts us more at risk. So what Trump is doing with his strikes on the Houthis, for example, and his strikes on the boats in Venezuela, and now his strikes in Iran, is blowing through the munitions that were designed to keep us safe. And by the way, the idea that the reason we're low on those munitions is because of Ukraine is completely wrong. The munitions that we sent to Ukraine, which by the way has been extremely careful with them, it's gone through fewer Patriot missiles in 4 years of war than Trump has gone through this last week, is because we sent old things that were going to be decommissioned and built new ones. So that's not what they're using over there. In fact, our biggest buyers of American weaponry are the Saudis, the Saudi Arabia and Israel. And of course, Trump's been using them like they're, M&Ms, right? So that idea that somehow Ukraine is responsible for our problem here is just that dog doesn't hunt. But so partly the problem here is that Trump is just doing this sort of on his own, and it's costing our military and our the things that are designed to keep us safe. But also part of the problem is a really cosmic one. And that is that we are spending what estimates of at least $1 billion a day of our money on a war that Donald Trump chose to go to on his own, one that experts are now horrified by as it is widening every day. And that's money that we cannot spend on healthcare or on education or on so many of the programs that Americans depend on. So we are literally taking our money and spending it as Donald Trump wants us to, in ways that don't obviously benefit Americans at all. There was not an imminent threat there. Certainly there were things in place to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Trump tore up the JCPOA that was negotiated in 2015 between Obama and Iran and a number of other countries to stop their nuclear capabilities for bomb making, not for nuclear power. But Trump tore that up in 2018. So there was room to work within the framework of the global system to keep Americans safe from a nuclear weapon being handled by Iran. And of course, we're not doing anything about the nuclear weapons the North Koreans have and so on. But Trump chose to do this in this moment, and there does not seem to be an upside for the United States of America. There seems to be an upside for the Saudis and for Netanyahu. And I think it's important to make a distinction between Israel, the country, and Netanyahu, the political leader. And the same time, the American people have been dragged into that. Well, we're not funding the things that we know the American people want, like healthcare and better education, better transportation and cheaper energy and so on. We're getting the opposite of that. So when we talk about this coming down to the idea that Congress should have the final say here, that's really important. And it's important not because it's like, well, I don't like President Trump, although I don't like President Trump. It's true. It's because I am watching my tax dollars, but everybody's tax dollars, go to a war of choice that certainly seems to be making this world one heck of a lot more dangerous than it was before he did this. And I'm not seeing my neighbors get health care or my neighbors' children get education. And to me, that very quickly looks not only like a failed democracy, because we don't have any say in how our money's being spent, not to mention our lives, but also a failed state, because then if we let this go as it is, Donald Trump becomes the Putin of America, where he can do whatever he wants. And that is extremely dangerous. Now, before I send you off in the world all depressed, remember that this war is enormously unpopular. And it is going to be more unpopular as oil prices continue to go through the roof and as that rise in energy prices begins to hurt the economy. And that the administration has had to back off in a number of places because of its lack of popular support. So Noam got left behind or got fired, not just because of the stupid stuff she was saying in front of Congress, but because her handling of the Department of Homeland Security was so unpopular, Trump was willing to throw her under the bus. And I would urge you to keep up pressure on all of the fronts you've been keeping up pressure, but not to forget those Epstein files, which are more damning by the minute. That the administration dropped more of them when it looked as if there were going to be charges coming forward for them breaking the Epstein Files Transparency Act by withholding a number of files. Now today they said, oopsie, or I guess it was last night, they said, oopsie poopsie, we meant to let those go, but there are still a whole bunch that have not been let go. And that is going to continue to weaken this administration. And so I would urge you to keep the pressure up and not to lose hope, because the reason I just get into such detail about why this is not simply Yahoo, Trump's bombing things, because I think one of the things that the attack on Iran has shown or could show to the American people who have not been paying attention, I know you all are, but a lot of our neighbors aren't, is that this protection, the system that protected us for 80 years is going away if we don't step up in favor of it. And when it does, what will come to us is not only the potential for really destructive wars, but also the potential to lose our ability to determine where our tax dollars are going. And if there's one thing that people care about in the United States, it's where their tax dollars are going. And that pressing that point, the point that we need to reassert control over our government, is getting traction. And you can see that it's getting traction in the number of speeches that our elected officials are giving, that talk about the Constitution and talk about the Declaration of Independence and point out that this is a government that belongs to the American people. And by God, we want it back. So anyway, thank you for being here. And I think so much is coming at us so fast, and I know it's exhausting. We're in it now. I kept telling you it was going to be bad in the spring. We're there. It's bad. It's going to get worse in some ways, but it's going to get better in others. Can't you feel the transition, the rockiness, the choppiness It's very much there right now, and it's going to be a rough ride. But I'll leave you with a story. There used to be a guy I would read who wrote once a year on a blog I read all the time about how to keep yourself safe on the road. He was a long haul trucker. And I read it every year because in my job at the time, I had to drive a long way. And, why not take advice from a guy who knows how to do it? And one of the things that he said that has always stuck with me is that if you're in an accident or approaching an accident, keep driving. That he said, the difference between making it out of an accident and not making it out of an accident is often keeping your hands on the wheel and just continuing to drive. Like, don't take your hands off the wheel and put your hands over your eyes because you're heading into a bad situation. Just keep driving. And that, I kind of feel like that's where we are right now. We're in that moment when we just need to keep driving, trying to keep it, between the navigational beacons, if you will. Permit me to mix my metaphors, and recognize that those of us who are trying to do that, we're just doing the best we can. Give each other a little bit of slack, but there are an awful lot of us trying to hold the ship steady right now, and more people every day. And if you can't feel it, look around you because you're going to see it everywhere. Um, another new, another No King's Day coming up March 28th, if I'm correct. More and more voices in going into the spring as the weather warms up across the country. You're going to see more and more of that. So let's just keep driving through these rocky weeks and doing the best we can to keep the ship upright. Because for all the rockiness, there's a lot of hope on the horizon as well, with the extraordinarily high unpopularity levels of this president and of this administration, and with Americans waking up to recognize they really would like to live in a democracy, and they really would like to be safe at home and to have control over their tax dollars, have a right to be treated equally before the law, and have a right to have a say in their government. And as they do that, that ship is going to get steadier and steadier going forward. So keep the faith, and I will see you again real soon. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook. And the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.